Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, Doug Ford's Conservatives got it done. In two by-elections Thursday night, we'll do a deep dive post-mortem.
Meanwhile, the Kefia ban is still on as the opposition leader tells the Premier to get the ban undone.
Speaking of bans, cell phones and vapes will no longer be allowed in Ontario schools.
And Premier Doug Ford opens a new provincial office in Ottawa, and one of his biggest critics is on his own backbench.
Intriguing. In your column, my column, I'll take you back to 10 years ago this week and the historic events leading to Ontario electing its first ever female premier.
And I ask whether anyone's serious about fixing municipal balance sheets.
A very McGrath story. It's Friday, May 3rd, 2024, so let's get to it. Okay, partner, for those who are unable to see us and who are only listening on podcast, we should explain what we're wearing here today because I'm looking back. You're looking forward. You're looking forward to tomorrow?
Yes, tomorrow being the 4th of May, or as those of us who are more nerdily inclined like to say, May the 4th be with you. And I'm wearing a shirt to describe it for our listeners with Boba Fett looking at a calendar of May 4th.
I may actually be nerdier than you on this one, and I'll tell you why. Do you know what I think of first when I think of May the 4th?
What do you think?
Well, first, I guess I should say second. The first thing I think of is I got a kid with a birthday on May the 4th. So I do think of that.
Good to get that one in.
Yes. The second thing I think of, that's the day Leslie Frost died, May the 4th, Premier of Ontario in the 1950s. So I know it's Star Wars days for normal people, but for some of us, that's the day Leslie Frost died.
Also the day I got my first COVID shot. A few years ago.
Well, that doesn't quite rise to the level of significance as those other two
but
things.
I was wearing this
okay.
T-shirt when it happened.
Oh, you were. Very good. Now, of course, with apologies to people in Ottawa who love their Ottawa Senators and the people in southwestern Ontario who probably love the Detroit Red Wings, they're not playing anymore. But the Leafs still are. Amazing. Now, our relationship will very much depend on whether you get the answer to this next question correct.
Okay.
Did you watch the game last night?
I did not. I was watching Star Trek, man.
Are you like, I'm really starting to wonder about your sanity. The whole province is obsessed right now with this great story of the Leafs pushing the Bruins to 7 games without Austin Matthews and using their backup goalie. And you're watching Star Trek?
And the Leafs seem to be profiting from me not watching, so maybe you want me to not turn on.
Good point. No more watching, not that you ever did. And let's get on to issue 1. 2 by-elections on Thursday and 2 big wins for Doug Ford's Tories. Let's start in Milton, in Halton Region, where PC candidate Z. Ahmed held on to the seat vacated earlier this year by Cabinet Minister Parm Gill, who quit to run federally. JMM, we saw polls, I guess about a week ago, showing a 1-point difference between the PCs and the Liberal candidate. In the end, the PCs won by 9. Now, normally, Tories hold 2 ridings they previously held is not much of a story, but a little deeper dive into the numbers does show some interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting case. Hamid beat Liberal Galen Naidoo-Harris by a larger margin than Parm Gill beat his last challenger in 2022. Hamid beat Naidoo-Harris by more than 2,400 votes, or as you mentioned, just under 9% of votes cast, while in 2022, Parm Gill beat Liberal Samir Ali by only about 5 percentage points, or 1,700 votes. So any way you slice it, the Tory margin in Milton had improved substantially last night relative to where it was 2 years ago.
Well, Team Ford threw everything and the kitchen sink at that riding in an effort to win it, and it worked. Now, last week we flagged how the Liberal candidate, Galen Naidoo-Harris, tried to appeal to Muslim residents, which is a quarter of the population in Milton, by taking a stand on the situation in the Middle East. He was very much pro-Palestinian in things, saying, of course, people ought to be allowed to wear the keffiyeh at Queen's Park. This appears not to have done him any favors in this riding.
Right, and we should say both parties were very cognizant of the substantial Muslim minority in Milton, the division within the Tory caucus at Queen's Park over the keffiyeh is, at least in part, because Premier Ford and his team did not want to risk inflaming tensions in Milton as part of this whole contest. It doesn't seem to have helped Naidoo-Harris, I think we can say. He came in substantially behind both what the polls were predicting and what the Liberal challenger did 2 years earlier.
Let's go to southwestern Ontario because there was also a by-election in Lambton-Kent-Middlesex. to replace the former Labour Minister Monty McNaughton. And as expected, as we've been saying for weeks and weeks, the Tories held that easily, with Steve Pinsonneau winning by 34 points. Monty McNaughton, I should say winning by 34 points, Monty McNaughton won it by 40 points in the general election 2.5 years ago. So obviously, Tories hang on to a seat that they were destined to win is not that interesting a story, but who came second is a bit of an interesting story here, because 2 years ago it was the NDP, and last night it was the Liberals. What does that tell you?
Well, not a great night for the NDP. As you point out, they came in second in the 2022 election, but they also were second place in 2018 and 2014 as well. The Liberals just had not been doing better than third place in any of those elections, going back to 2011 was the last time they were in second place. But there they were last night in second place with I would say, a respectable showing, 20 plus points. Showing a bit more life in southwestern Ontario than we've seen from the party in many years, right? They really started to struggle in southwestern Ontario. They more or less got blown out of everything west of London in 2014. Neither the NDP nor the Liberals have a lot to crow about from the results in Lambton-Kent-Middlesex. But if you wanted to tell a story about Liberal fortunes improving, I mean, you really can't do it that much with the results in Milton. But Lambton-Kent-Middlesex is an interesting riding where, the Liberals don't just want to do well in the GTA. I know there are people in the party, people like Dwight Duncan, for example, who it's actually like personally painful for them that the party has sunk so low in southwestern Ontario. So the fact that they did better last night in Lambton-Kent-Middlesex is the kind of thing that they might see as an early sign of their fortunes improving.
I don't want to rain on their parade too much, but they did run a very popular local mayor there as their Liberal candidate, and this may be more a factor of her popularity than of the party's popularity. Let's also remind people, by-elections either are really important, where the fate of the government could be at stake, or they're not. and this was one of those not.
Yeah.
I mean, that was not the case here. Ford had a majority going into this. Even if he had lost both of these by-elections, he was still going to have that majority. But we should do a little bit of analysis here on who, in your view, has to carry the can for the fact that the Liberals, okay, maybe a few spots of interest here, but they lost two. One of them, they appear to have had a shot at winning.
Right. So this is really the first big test for Bonnie Crombie since becoming leader of the Liberal Party last fall. A big disappointment for her, I think it's fair to say. Milton is the kind of riding that really will make or break a Liberal government. If they are going to form government, they are going to have to carry seats like Milton. And the fact that they weren't able to close the deal last night, it is going to cause some reflection among the Liberal leadership right now. The party is left where they were, before the votes were cast yesterday. They still do not have an MPP, not just west of Toronto, but west of Yonge Street in Toronto.
That is shocking. I heard you say that. The Liberals don't have an MPP west of Yonge Street. Yeah. That's really quite amazing. Yeah. Well, the question for me is who has to really carry the can more on this? Is this a reflection of the fact that Bonnie Crombie is not taking off as leader? Might be some of that happening. I suspect it has more to do with the fact that the current Prime Minister of Canada is Justin Trudeau, and he is, if you talk to Liberals at Queen's Park, if you talk to people all over the place, they will privately acknowledge that the Prime Minister's lack of popularity right now is a real millstone hurting provincial Liberal fortunes. And this harkens me back, everything harkens me back, but this harkens back to 1984. I do remember David Peterson is the leader of the Ontario Liberals. The current Prime Minister's father is the Prime Minister of the country, and his polling numbers are in the dumpster. And David Peterson was asked, is Pierre Trudeau causing you any problems in terms of your ability to attract voters? And Peterson said, he's an albatross around my neck, which is a heck of a thing for a provincial Liberal leader to say about the federal Liberal Prime Minister. Yeah. But I suspect there are a lot of Liberals saying the same thing in Ontario today about Pierre Trudeau's son. It just feels that way.
Well, and, going back to last year's by-election in Kitchener Centre, I absolutely heard that from the Liberal candidate in that riding, that she felt that Prime Minister Trudeau's popularity really was hurting the brand. I think you could make that case in Milton, where they have a local Liberal MPP, and is very closely associated with Prime Minister Trudeau as well.
Yeah.
And, it is, of course, the job of party spin doctors to put the best possible face on sometimes bad news. The Liberals are clearly trying to do that. They have they put out this press release yesterday evening saying, like, we've demonstrated that we're the clear alternative to the government. Strong second place showing in both ridings.
It's true.
It's true.
It's true as far as it goes.
As far as it goes, it still has not changed the seat count, and the result of the seat count is that, unfortunately, the Liberals are still not a recognized party at Queen's Park, and they don't get all of the benefits that flow from that, whether that be time on camera during question period or legislative funding.
How about turnout last night?
Oh, I will say this kind of pained me a little bit. The turnout in Milton was just under 28%. And like, you never get your hopes up for turnout in a by-election anyway, because you're just going to give yourself heartbreak. But I think we could both say that is underwhelming. But what struck me was that in Lambton-Kent-Middlesex, the turnout was actually just a bit over 30%. It was higher in the riding that we never expected to be competitive than it was in Milton, where we actually thought it would be a bit of a competitive race. And normally you expect like a competitive race where the both parties are really pouring their energy into it. You expect that to be the one that gets a bit of a goose in the turnout, and it just didn't happen. Very strange indeed. Well,
I guess we got to go here. Yes. Events in the Middle East are continuing to have an effect on Ontario politics. 2 weeks and counting since the keffiyeh ban at Queen's Park became an irritant among several MPPs. If you've been following this, you will know that all four major party leaders at Queen's Park, Doug Ford, Mart Styles, Bonnie Crombie, Mike Schreiner, they want the Speaker's ban on the keffiyeh to be overturned. Making that happen, of course, would require unanimous consent of all MPPs, and that has proved to be elusive. This week, the opposition leader, Mart Styles, NDP leader, went on X to tell the Premier to get it done.
Hi, I'm Mart Styles, leader of Ontario's NDP. We've been working to reverse the keffiyeh ban inside the walls of Queen's Park, but Doug Ford's MPPs keep blocking us. So we decided to give the government until May 6 to reverse this unjust rule, or expect us and the community to defy the ban. Doug Ford, it's time for you to do the right thing.
Now, while the keffiyeh may be banned at Queen's Park, it is not in other political arenas. And we want to put this picture up right now. And for those who are listening on podcast, we will describe. This is a picture of a Hamilton School Board trustee named Sabrina Tuhab, and she is what appears to be at a council meeting, a school board meeting, wearing her keffiyeh. And she is a friend of Hamilton Centre MPP Sarah Jama, whom we know has been wearing her keffiyeh in the legislature despite the Speaker's prohibition on doing so. She, of course, having been thrown out of the NDP caucus for a whole bunch of reasons we don't want to get into right here. And I should mention, I was speaking to a Tory backbencher just the other day about why Sarah Jama was not ejected from the legislature despite disregarding or ignoring the Speaker's prohibition on keffiyeh wearing. And apparently this is what happened. This is according to this backbencher I was talking to. The Speaker ruled that Sarah Jama should be ejected from the legislature. The sergeant-at-arms, whose job it is to sort of be the cop on scene, went up to her and said, he has ruled you can't wear that. I have to eject you. And she said, I'm not leaving. And so the sergeant-at-arms went up to the Speaker and said, it will require force to eject the member, which is apparently what you say when somebody refuses to leave. And at that moment, I mean, let's just tell it like it is here. At that moment, Speaker Ted Arnott realized that the image of a black woman who needs a wheelchair to get around being forcibly lifted out of her chair and removed from the chamber was not going to be a good look. And so he essentially let it go. Now, the House did not sit this past week, so Sarah Jama could not attempt to re-enter the chamber with her keffiyeh on. Yeah. And that's where we're at right now. Yeah, it's a really interesting case because there are
we've talked about parliamentary privilege on this podcast quite a bit, and one of the privileges that adheres to individual members is that at least there's a very strong presumption that they should not be prevented from entering the chamber. And it's entirely possible to imagine Sarah Jama entering the chamber without wearing a keffiyeh, getting herself into her spot in the chamber, and then putting a keffiyeh on and basically daring the speaker to do something about it.
So the story's not over.
The story is not over. We will see what happens next week when the House returns. And with that, on to issue 2.
Back to basics. That is the party line for Doug Ford's Progressive Conservatives when it comes to our public schools. And this week, back to basics has meant reducing distractions, specifically the use of cell phones and nicotine vapes on school grounds.
So let's start with the details of what the government announced. $30 million for vape detectors and other security upgrades. I assume these are machines in the high school bathrooms that, like they used to have smoke detectors in my high school bathrooms.
Because you were constantly trying to sneak a smoke, is that why?
Well, I wasn't, but
Sure.
I knew kids who were.
Sure.
$17 million on what the government calls wraparound services. This includes services to help treat students with addictions and educational awareness about harms of both vaping and excessive cell phone usage, and as well as improved parental involvement policies to make sure that parents know what's going on in these schools. Some of the new rules, we mentioned these cell phone bans. Students in kindergarten to grade 6 will be required to keep phones on silent and out of sight for the entire school day unless explicitly permitted by an educator. And then students grades 7 to 12, cell phones will not be permitted during class time unless explicitly directed by an educator. And social media websites will be removed from all school networks and devices, and report cards will include a comment on the student's distraction level in class. So the government here is promising to provide mandatory training for teachers and new supports both for students and parents.
We don't often get too personal on this podcast, but this feels like one of those opportunities to do so because you've got a kid in the school system.
I do indeed.
And how do you read this?
Well, the intention here all seems basically good. I mean, and I will do a sort of hybrid commentary here, both as a reporter and a parent. We know that phones are incredibly distracting. I feel like I don't even need to cite evidence for that.
I can't imagine why you
Steve,
say that.
put the phone down.
Why are you saying that? I can't imagine why you're saying that right now.
But, if people do, in fact, require a citation for this, there was a recent study that was published from Norway, which it got a lot of press, found that banning cell phones improved mental health outcomes, reduced rates of bullying, was particularly beneficial for young girls and for people from households with lower incomes. So that would broadly say to me that this is actually kind of a progressive policy. And then as for vaping, I mean, I think even maybe 5 years ago, there was some debate about whether vaping could be on net beneficial if it caused people to smoke fewer tobacco cigarettes. More recent research suggests that vaping, particularly for young people, is actually making them more likely to start smoking cigarettes. So any idea that there's a net benefit seems to go out the window there. And it is undoing, to a certain extent, it is undoing the decades of hard work that we have done collectively as a society to try and reduce smoking, particularly in young people.
Indeed. And I think if I can circle back to the first point that you laid out there, one of the interesting side angles on this story is the notion of putting monitoring devices in school bathrooms to make sure kids are not vaping in there. And I can tell you, because I did have a kid in high school a few years ago, and I got lots of reports from her on the kind of mischief that goes on in bathrooms. And, she assured me there's plenty of vaping and smoking and all other various nefarious things going on in bathrooms. And I'm sure that some students and some parents are going to, play the privacy right card here and say, school boards, you ought not to do this. I'm not sure how far they're going to get with that argument, given what the government wants to do here.
We know that, in fact, the Education Minister, Stephen Lecce, has said that he thinks there do need to be some guardrails, I believe was the phrase he used, on the use of these devices to make sure that no really egregious privacy breaches occur. And this is always a danger when school boards deploy new technologies. There's some real horror stories from the U.S. that I won't go into now because we don't have the time. But it will absolutely be something that we have to discuss collectively. But, enforcement is going to be the $64,000 question, if I can put it that way. It is one thing for the government to announce these policies, but the rubber is going to meet the road when an actual teacher has to tell an actual student to put the actual phone away. And what support will that teacher have, both sort of bureaucratically, will the principal and the school board trustees, will everybody be in a line to support that teacher making that call in that room? We will see.
Yeah, we shall see indeed. Let's talk money while we're on the subject here of education, because the government did announce that they are increasing the so-called core education funding for the coming school year by $745 million as compared to 2023-24. And that came as the government announced a major reorganization of how it funds public education across the province. MPP Chandra Pasma, who's the NDP critic for education, released the following statement about the education funding announcement. For 6 straight years, Pasma said, education funding has failed to keep pace with inflation under this Conservative government's watch. That's the opposition view. What's your assessment?
I mean, on the numbers, it is just true to say that education funding has not kept pace with inflation. I mean, in part, that's because we had an unusually high level of inflation for several years. But the Ontario Public School Boards Association estimates that since the Tories won in 2018, per pupil inflation-adjusted funding has dropped by about $776. That's basically inflation-adjusted per head in the schools. Put it another way, costs for school boards have grown, but provincial funding has not matched the increased expenses.
So what does that actually look like in the classroom?
Ricardo Tranjan, an analyst with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, they are, I think it's fair to say, a left-wing organization that's very critical of the Ford government, though they were also critical of the Liberal government previously. Tranjan estimates that there are 5,000 fewer teachers working in Ontario today than there were in 2018.
Now, the government's also requiring school boards to share more information about their finances with the public. What's all that about?
Yeah, the government is calling this the School Board Financial Transparency Tool, and it will be a website hosted and administered by the province showing how much funding school boards received and how it was spent. School boards will be required to link to this webpage from their own websites. So whatever school board your kid is enrolled in, that website, for example, the TDSB, will have to link to this provincial webpage. Now, why? Well, the government knows that it is going to spend, I think, the next several years, it's fair to say, battling the political charge that it has cut school funding.
This is always an interesting argument because if you spend, I'm plucking these numbers out of thin air, $35 billion on education this year, and you spend $35 billion and 2 cents on education next year, you are spending more on education.
Yes.
But in real terms, you actually aren't because, of course, inflation eats away at that money. So in real terms, you're spending less. So as the government tries to make the argument that they're spending more, how should we react?
Well, so the current projections are that the government will spend $39.4 billion in the 2026 fiscal year, which will be the last budget before the next general election. And I think that's really what this is about. So that's why I picked that year. The last Liberal budget in 2018 was set to spend $29.1 billion. So over 8 years, we will have seen an increase of about $10 billion since Premier Ford took office.
So in other words, the current government of Ontario, the progressive Conservative government, will be forcing school boards to say, look, we're spending more than $10 billion more than the Liberals were way back when, and therefore we're spending more. Yes?
Yes, that is, I think, what is basically going on here. I got to say, I don't think it is going to help the government very much.
Because?
Because parents have eyes. I drop off my kid in the morning. I pick them up in the afternoon. We go to parent-teacher conferences. This is totally normal, banal parent behavior. And, I have a pretty good read on what is going on at my kid's school. And maybe this is just from my experience as a reporter, but I do have some idea of what could be improved at that school if there was more money available. And I don't think that's a particularly unique experience. So the government, and I've got to say, I think this is like a disease of modern political communications. The government is really hoping that parents are going to believe numbers on a website instead of their own eyes. And I just don't think it's going to work.
Really? Who are you going to believe? Your lying eyes or... Yeah, I get it. All right. All right. And with that, we're on to issue 3. Ottawa is, of course, our nation's capital. It is also the 2nd largest city in Ontario, and it's a very political town. So Premier Doug Ford thought perhaps the government of Ontario should have a special office there from which to lobby the federal government, etc. Other provinces have offices in Ottawa, so why not Ontario? Sounds reasonable, except what?
Well, except that the guy that they have announced will be the first director of this office is a former defeated Progressive Conservative candidate who lost in last summer's by-election. One of Ottawa's own Progressive Conservative MPPs has announced that she is publicly opposed to the idea, does not think it's a good idea to go forward.
The plot thickens. Okay, so let's pick this apart. Tell us about the appointee.
The appointee is Sean Webster, as I say, a former Progressive Conservative candidate, lost in last summer's Canada-Carleton by-election. He is also an exec with one of the major cannabis corporations, the Canopy Growth Corporation. The controversy here, I mean, aside from just us appointing a former Progressive Conservative candidate to this kind of office, you generally have the accusation that this is basically just a patronage gig for a friendly Tory. The Premier's office also hasn't confirmed how much this job will pay. The Premier is saying that he will leave that decision to his Chief of Staff. He didn't have the number at hand. And I mean, the other thing we should say is, like, yes, other provinces have offices in Ottawa, but Ottawa doesn't exist as a city in other provinces.
Ottawa is in Ontario.
Yes.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's a bit of an odd arrangement.
You know, I'm debating with myself whether to weigh in on this here. And let me just say this. 2 things. Number one, did we really expect Premier Ford to appoint a Liberal New Democrat or Green to this job? I think the answer, it's fair to say, is no. I think governments like to appoint people to jobs who have like-minded views to their own. So the fact that the government is appointing a Tory to this job, I think, cannot be a shock. The bigger story to me is whether or not, A, this office actually has a point. Is there a purpose and a real mission to this office? Because if there isn't, then it does look like patronage. If it's a real job with real work to really advance Ontario's interests, okay, that's a different story. Let's now pivot to this other thing that you referenced, which is the fact that the most prominent MPP in the Ottawa area doesn't like this idea.
Right. We are referring
and
here
she's a Tory.
Yes, indeed. We are referring here to Lisa Macleod, the MPP for Nepean, refused to attend the announcement of this office and has publicly opposed it.
And has she said why she's publicly opposed this?
She did not give, I would say, precise reasons in comment, but said to Global News, or rather, I should say, an email received by Global News included the words, "It's not a great idea and I won't attend." There are other local politicians in the Ottawa area who've been vocal about what this looks like to them. Ottawa City Councillor Sean Menard told CBC News that the city should not be treated like some faraway place. And it does vaguely have this feel of like the Premier is sending like an ambassador to Ottawa. And then, of course, there are Liberals, substantially well represented in Ottawa as well. John Fraser, the once and again party leader, as well as Stephen Blais. They have both been quoted criticizing how this feels to them like wasteful spending, invoking the famous gravy train phrase again, which they are enjoying.
Let me come back to that, the gravy train notion in a second, because it's not inconceivable that Lisa Macleod may have looked at this whole thing and said, you know what? That's my work. That's my job. I'm an Ottawa area MPP, and you're taking work that I have been doing for, how long has she been there? 15 years or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. You're taking that work away from me, and maybe that's why she's not on side.
Well, no, and I think this is the important point. The thing that I think might not be obvious to people who aren't, political obsessives. The normal person to do this kind of work would be an Ottawa area MPP who you would appoint to a seat in cabinet, and they would be the Premier's point person for Ottawa issues or Eastern Ontario issues.
Except
that if we go down the list of MPPs who might at least theoretically be available to Doug Ford, you've got somebody like Steve Clark, an Eastern Ontario MPP, unfortunately tainted by the Greenbelt scandal. Lisa Macleod was in cabinet, was not reappointed to cabinet. There are people like Goldie Gamari, who is also Ottawa adjacent, but for whatever reason has not been elevated to cabinet by this premier. And so I do think it's fair, at least, to view Macleod's criticism in this context that, as you say, this is the kind of job that she, or at least one of her Eastern Ontario colleagues, should be doing. And it's a fair question to ask, why invent this whole new position instead of just naming one of them to cabinet?
And with that, let's find out what my co-host and I have been writing about on TVO.org this past week. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about what we wrote for the website this past week. What have you got for us?
I wrote about a housing announcement. You will be shocked to learn.
I cannot believe it. I'm just I'm completely gobsmacked here.
Yeah, I know. It's like, yeah. What can I say? The housing is in the news a lot.
It is.
Friend of the show and Liberal MPP Adil Shamji made a housing announcement for the Liberal Party at Queen's Park this week. There was a bunch of stuff in there responding to the government's most recent housing bill, but I really wanted to focus on the idea of a new financial framework for municipalities. This is an idea that comes and goes pretty regularly at Queen's Park. Basically, the idea that municipalities in Ontario are not really set up to handle all of the costs that come from growth. Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow has taken to using the example of the Taylor Swift concert that is coming later this year. It will generate millions and millions of dollars in revenue for the federal government and the provincial government, and $0 for Toronto. And it will, in fact, cost Toronto a great deal of money in things like police overtime. So everybody acknowledges, or I think most people would acknowledge, that some kind of major structural change to Ontario's municipal finances is needed. But this is where it always gets complicated. It actually requires a government that is willing to either raise taxes and transfer that money to municipalities on its own, or give municipalities more taxing and spending powers independent of Queen's Park, neither of which are politically easy, and some of it would actually require the government to give up its own ability to meet its own spending priorities. So I'm actually kind of like despondent about this whole topic because we've watched this cycle sort of come and go, but I wrote about, I think the headline on the piece is something like, does Adil Shamji or do the Liberals actually have the stomach for this kind of thing? And Shamji on X, formerly Twitter, reposted the story and with the word "yes" as the single response.
That was it.
So we will see.
Yeah, as with all things, time will tell.
And how about you?
Well, yesterday I wrote one of those columns that I like to write every now and then because it was a major anniversary. It was 10 years ago yesterday that Kathleen Wynne marched to the Lieutenant Governor's office and said to David Onley, I am about to lose the confidence of the legislature because the NDP is not going to support my budget. And rather than go through the shenanigans of 2 weeks of debate, which I know are going to end in failure, let's go to the polls right now. So the 2014 election was called 10 years ago yesterday. The Liberals had a $29 billion infrastructure plan in the window. That was the big part of their campaign strategy. And incidentally, a lot of what Doug Ford is building right now, light rail transit lines all over the province, is stuff that the Wynne government started. Okay, there you go. The Progressive Conservative campaign, PCs at the time led by Tim Hudak, I think it's fair to say that the big announcement they made that captured the most attention was Mr. Hudak's pledge to eliminate 100,000 positions in the broader public service. Now, this didn't mean firing 100,000 people on day one that he took over. It meant over the 4 years, through attrition, through retirements, through people leaving for other jobs, and yes, through some layoffs, they were going to reduce the public service by 100,000 people. Yeah. And the broader public sector, which has 1 million people in it. The Liberals were very skillful in the way that they portrayed that announcement as, he's going to fire you and your neighbor tomorrow. Yeah. And they had, you remember in Sesame Street, they had this guy, the Count?
Yes.
Okay, so they had a guy dressed up as the Count, dogging Tim Hudak at his events as if to say, I'm counting all the jobs you are going to eliminate. Right. And there was this one event that that Kathleen Wynne did, where she was, I think there may be 60, 70 people in the background, all of whom were holding up signs saying police, nurse, paramedic, firefighter, with the idea being these are all the jobs Tim Hudak is going to come after. And on election night, no one was sure, actually, whether the Liberals were going to win a minority or a majority. And, you know, they got, I think it's like barely 38% of the total vote. And she won a majority. And it was, you know, it was an historic event because it was the first time in Ontario history that Ontarians had elected a woman to be their premier, right? She inherited the job at her leadership convention, but this was the first time a female Ontario Party leader won an election. And if you go to Queen's Park today, you know, up on that second floor, you'll see portraits. Doug Ford hasn't done his portrait yet, so you'll see 24 men and 1 woman. So Kathleen Wynne's position in history is secured. She's the first.
You know, I remember 2 things about that election. One, as you said, it came right after the government had introduced its budget, and this was the first time I had covered a budget in a full lockup. And my colleagues and I was working for a different outlet at the time. My colleagues and I, we must have written, I want to say, like 6,000 or 7,000 words about various parts of the budget. We had just banged out a whole bunch of stories, and within 24 hours, it was all worthless.
That's right.
So that was one thing. The other thing I remember is the last days of that campaign, and you know, you say that we didn't know whether it would be a minority or a majority, but Wynne had inherited a very slim minority, right? They were only whatever it was.
They were 1 seat short of a majority.
Well, they won 1 seat of a majority, but then they lost some by-elections. So
Yes.
they were 2 or 3 seats short of a majority. And I just remember the simmering anger among the NDP because they could see all of the seats that they were going to lose in Toronto, which they did in fact lose. I live in Beaches, East York. Michael Prue was one of the New Democrats who lost in 2014, and you could just see it starting to bubble. And there was a great deal of anger at Andrea Horwath in the days after that election, both for effectively forcing an election that she didn't seem immediately ready to contest, and you go into that in your piece, and then with the pretty dismal results for the NDP after the fact.
They started that election with 21 seats. They ended that election with 21 seats. Seemed much ado about nothing for them, except that the Liberals got the majority back, and the NDP no longer was in a position of being able to influence events at Queen's Park because they didn't hold the balance of power anymore.
Yeah, the only thing that they ended up with after the fact was they did actually end up with some committee chairs, but that is a story that I will go into in another time, perhaps.
I bet you will. Anyway, and it all started 10 years ago yesterday. Now, before we move on, we want to give a quick shout out to our TVO friend Nam Kiwanuka, whose columns received a nomination for the Best Column category at the Digital Publishing Awards this past week. So kudos to Nam.
Yeah, this is one column features Nam's firsthand experience, specifically the ways gynecological care fell short in her own experience and her own visits with Ontario's public hospitals.
Yeah, so if you haven't seen those yet, check out Nam's piece. Go to our website, tvo.org. Gynecological care is in shambles. That's the headline you want to look for. And kudos to her, and we'll keep our fingers crossed for her doing well.
Yeah. With that, let's go to the mailbag.
If you have a burning question or insightful comment, we'll take either. Send it along to onpolitics@tvo.org. And just before we do that, I want to give a shout out to a guy who's visiting us today. Gord McNulty was a journalist at the Hamilton Spectator, my hometown newspaper, for I think almost 40 years, and he covered Queen's Park during some of the most interesting time there. It was 1977 to 81. Which was Bill Davis's second minority government, and it was really probably the best example of 3 parties working together, collegial democracy in the province of Ontario. And he was a lucky enough guy to have a front row seat to all of that and reported on it all. And Gord's in the control room just watching us. He came in here today to visit. So hello, Gord, and great to see you again. That's my Gord was my guy back in the day. I used to read his stuff all the time. Anyway, here we go. Let's get one letter in before the clock runs out on us here. Hi, John, Steve. I wanted to write regarding John's article/podcast discussion regarding electric vehicles. I really think that you're not looking into a major solution for many of the issues you raised regarding using electric vehicles to ease the grid. Why does government have to be the one leading this? I feel this is an area where the private sector can resolve these challenges far better than the government, as they have a financial incentive. I'd like to see you explore this issue. Regards, Cameron McGill. Okay, what you think?
So Cameron, a bit more of his email, he specifically mentioned the idea of EV owners selling electricity back to their employers. The idea being that in Ontario right now, we can actually buy electricity very cheaply overnight for EV owners in particular, and they could then sell that electricity back to their employers when their cars are parked in the big parking lots or parking garages, in the places of work, office towers, malls, that kind of thing. And I wanted to answer this email a bit late because we sat on this for a bit longer than I intended. But Cameron is quite correct. And I actually spoke with a government regulator about this issue in particular because, big parking lots in places like this office building that you and I are in right now are sort of like the last frontier of EV charging. We're getting a lot of the superchargers built, a lot of people charging at home. But during the day, these people drive their cars to work and then they just sit there idle for 8 hours a day. Yeah. And in particular, during the summer, when we have, in Ontario at least, everybody turns their air conditioners on in July and August, and we have that peak in summer demand, there's a really strong argument that would be the perfect time for EV batteries to be able to help put power onto the grid, and it might mean that we don't have to turn on natural gas plants, for example. Cameron asks, why does the government have to lead the way on this? In principle, I guess there's no reason why they have to, but in Ontario, everything about electricity regulation is wrapped up in government policy. Even that very, very low overnight rate that I mentioned earlier, that was a political decision made by the current government. So there are lots of ways that individual EV owners and businesses, could help reshape the electrical grid, but I think, for better or worse in Ontario, it's always going to take some affirmative measure by the government to sort of get things rolling.
Gotcha. We have one last thing to say. Tomorrow, may the 4th be with you.
And may the 4th be with you.
And go Leafs go. Even though you won't be watching. Anyway, that is the onpoli podcast for this May 3rd, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Give us your first and last name and where you're coming from.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Tiffany Lamb. Video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell, Christine Gardner, Carla Lucchetta, and Vito Tagarelli.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks to our, I say this every week and I mean it, our wonderful studio crew for making the video podcast look so great. And hey, we got new background today, eh? Yeah. So should we give Kathleen Black a little shout out? Apparently she's the one behind a lot of this stuff here.
Oh, what wonderful. Thank you, Kathleen.
So nice job, Kathleen. Anyway, until next Friday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.